Hello everyone. If you know me from the fighting game community, you most likely know me as Aviator. If not, and you know me outside of that, you'll probably just know me as Dylan. But as most of you probably know by now, depending who's watching this at least, I've been getting into a lot of music over the course of the past year, and that's mostly come in the form of albums. I started listening to a lot of more music starting from the beginning of this year until the end of this year, and I continue to go forward with that into 2025 and also years after that because I've really found a love for this stuff, listening to new music, learning a lot from it, and stuff like that. But the point of this video is to focus on the albums that have been released this year, and I specifically want to get into my personal top 20 albums of the year. This entire list, to me, is filled with albums that are either, special to me in one form or another, or are just plain really fun albums. So let's get into it. First off, though, I do want to start out with some honorable mentions from this year. Of course, there were quite a few albums that didn't make my top 20 list this year that some of you may be very surprised didn't make my top 20 list. And we're actually going to start with probably one of the most surprising ones out of them, and that's going to be Chromacopia by Tyler, the Creator. This album, for me, I did think it was very good when it first released. I mean, the rollout process of this thing was easily one of the most exciting moments in music of this year. I mean, the album was announced and then dropped like a week later, but and it's a very personal album from Tyler. He touches on a lot of very personal subject matters. He's gone on to say that this album is kind of like his, Mr. Morale, referencing Kendrick Lamar in that respect. But I feel like for me, at least, I've gotten less out of this album the more I've listened to it. I feel like in comparison to an album like Mr. Morale, it doesn't have the same amount of layers to really dig into, and the emotional moments don't feel as high as an album like that. And some of the songs in the track list I do think maybe are like slightly bland or a little underwhelming, but overall though, I gotta say this album still is very good, and I still do think it earns its spot like on many people's like favorite albums of the year list. I'm definitely not upset to hear that people are loving this album quite a lot. It's just maybe not the most impressive entry for me personally. Next up is an album that I actually listened to quite a lot, at least earlier in the year, and that is going to be Schoolboy Q's Blue Lips. This is a really fun West Coast hip hop album. Schoolboy Q, of course, gets into a lot of jazz rap, boom bap, a lot of stuff like that, but also doesn't forget that like West Coast grit, like to his sound. There's a lot of beats on this thing that are heavy, they're really punchy. A lot of the beats on this thing switch up at like very rapid paces as well. It's really diverse of an album. I do think there are some instrumentals that for the most part I think maybe do come off as like a little bit bland or a little bit boring in comparison to others, but there are tracks on this thing that I really, really enjoy. Take Blue Slides, Thank God for Me, fantastic tracks that came out of that album. New as well. It's a really great hip hop album from the year, and it's one that I do think I'm going to come back to quite a bit. I even personally enjoy it over something like Oxymoron from him, which is a bit surprising given that that's kind of like, in many people's eyes, like the Schoolboy Q album, at least from what I've heard. But yeah, super solid album, just barely didn't make my top 20 though. Hi, you'll notice I'm in a different shirt this time. I forgot to record this part of the honorable mentions in my first recording, but the third honorable mention I want to make is for Glass Beach's new Plastic Death. I did really enjoy this album when it first released back in January. You'll notice from my review back then that I was singing this thing's praises like a lot. I thought it was absolutely incredible the first time I heard it. The reason it doesn't make my top 20 now is mostly just because it's kind of faltered maybe a little bit over time, given how much other music I've listened to, but it's still a very harrowing tale surrounding love, transgenderism, and everything in between. It's a really beautiful record. I think Comatose is definitely one of my favorite songs of the year as well. Super great album, just barely didn't make my top 20 though, and on to the last one. The last honorable mention I want to bring up is we're diverting a little bit from hip hop this time. We're going to go with A Dream Is All We Know by the Lemon Twigs. If you're into like power pop bands of like the 60s and 70s, think like the Beatles or Beach Boys, anything similar to that, this is going to be like one of your favorite albums of the year, in my opinion. It's super consistent, front to back. There's just fantastic songwriting all over this thing. The only reason it doesn't land in my top 20 is mostly just because it gets a little, outscaled by everything else that's in there. Reminder, there's been so much great music this year. It was very hard to pick, my top 20, especially in the lower half of it. But yeah, fantastic album. I really think you should check it out. Yeah, go ahead and give it a listen. All right, so now we're actually going to kick off our top 20, and in the 20th spot is going to be the new Igloo Ghost album, Title Memory XO. This album, to me at least, is one of the most chaotic releases of the year. This has some of the most punchy IDM, even drill music that you can find. All of the production on this thing is absolutely immaculate. There's these songs that are just complete flurries of electronic instrumentation, and they just blow you away. Like you're sitting in the back of your seat, just absolutely gobsmacked by all of the sounds that are present, like all over this album. The vocals on this thing are like, they're pretty catchy. They're very simple, but they keep like the flow of like all these tracks going. And yeah, this album is just filled with highlights for me. There's even some tracks that delve in trip hop a little bit and other more like chill, electronic sounds. And that mix just makes for an album that feels so diverse, but at the same time so punchy for me. And that's why it lands in my 20th spot. Next up at my number 19 spot is going to be a bit of a hip-hop favorite from this year, and that's going to be the new Makami album titled Rich Ass Haitian. I loved the production on this thing quite a bit. I did love the songs that sounded a lot more lo-fi. There's songs that have like a bit of a vinyl like pitch shift to them, or maybe a bit of like vinyl distortion to them as well, that I really do enjoy out of this thing. Makami raps about a lot of racial injustices, about growing up in Haiti as well, and it overall makes for one of the more introspective hip-hop albums of the year. But there really are some fantastic bangers on this thing. There's a song with Black Thought that I absolutely love. There's a song with Your Old Droog as well. It's just great hip-hop, like front to back on this thing. It's definitely an album you do not want to miss from 2024. Next up at my number 18 spot is going to be another hip-hop album from this year that I thought was super impressive. The new Vince Staples album, Dark Times. And this is an artist that I had only listened to one album from beforehand, that being Summertime '06. And it's an album that to this day I'm still very like hit or miss on. There's some tracks that I love from it. There's others that I'm like maybe not so crazy for. But this album blew that out of the water, and it's considered one of Vince Staples' best records to date at this point, and for good reason. The production on this thing is great. You get this wonderful, vibey, almost nostalgic kind of West Coast tinted boom bap all over this album. Vince Staples, of course, has a lot of lyricism that kind of deals in mental health, his own kind of struggles over the past few years and within his career. And it does make for an album that to some can be maybe a little bit depressing, but nonetheless, it is definitely one of the most impressive showings from this year for sure. And if you're a hip hop fan and you haven't heard this album this year yet, I don't know what you're doing personally. Fantastic album. At number 17, we're switching up the genre a little bit, and we're going into a pop release from this year that I really enjoyed, and that's going to be the new Last Dinner Party album, Prelude to Ecstasy. This album was one of the later ones that I checked out. I had only listened to it in December, actually. So it's a very recent entry from my list, which you're also going to see for another album that's going to land a bit higher up on this list. But Prelude to Ecstasy was fantastic. It is filled with these absolutely gorgeous Baroque pop songs that have these wonderful vocals from Abigail Morris, a lot of them dealing in femininity, masculinity, gender envy, all these, introspective feelings around like one's own gender identity, what it means to have certain feminine urges, where they come from, how are they passed down, stuff like that. It's such a beautiful and like touching album. Songs like On Your Side are honestly some of my favorite songs from the entire year. They really are a gut punch of emotion. And I really think this is yet another example of these rising bands coming out of the UK. As someone who's like a big Black Country New Road fan, a big Black Midi fan, a big Maruha fan, this is yet another example of these up and coming artists out of the UK just absolutely blowing us away with these debut records that sound absolutely fantastic. Really excited for what these girls do next. Absolutely loving this album, for sure, one of my favorites from the year. And believe it or not, in our number 16 spot, we're actually going to follow the last one up with yet another showcase of an up-and-coming UK artist that really blew me away this year, and that's going to be with Ugly UK with their new EP, Twice Around the Sun. This album was fantastic, or I say album, but it really is an EP, but they go into it with the same creative vision as an album. Everything here sounds like it fits so well together. And the thing is, I think, like 35 minutes long. It's pretty long for an EP. I think it's 6 tracks in total. And God, some of them, at least most of them, I should say, are absolutely mind-blowing. Hands of Man, I think, is one of my favorite songs from this year. Icy Windy Sky, absolutely beautiful. These songs have like such a beautiful kind of like indie folk art rock like sound to them. They're shimmering with like all these guitars, wonderful vocals here and there. The entire group has like a whole bunch of group vocals on this things that make these songs feel so huge, so alive, and all of that. It is fantastic. There's maybe like a song or two that I think can maybe get somewhat like a little bland or a little boring, but like it really doesn't like take you out of the experience of this EP. Really a fantastic showing from these guys. I am super excited to hear what these guys have next. The day they release a debut full-length album, I will be there day one. So yeah, go ahead and check this EP out. Sounds absolutely fantastic. At number 15 is one of 2 metal albums that you're going to see in this top 20. I'm not going to spoil when the other one comes up or which album it is just yet, but that's going to be Chat Pile's new album, Cool World. This is a sludge metal album that I actually wasn't sure if I was going to like all that much. I haven't been exposed to all that much metal outside of like, maybe a bunch of new metal I've listened to as a kid. And I had that same thought going into the other metal album that I listened to this year. But man, Cool World absolutely blew me away. There's some fantastic songs on here. A lot of it reminds me of the same kind of grungy feeling you would get out of Nirvana, especially with songs like Shame on this thing that really just rock. They are fantastic. And a lot of these songs deal in themes of like masculinity or the like, I guess, cruelty of the world around you, as like kind of, simplistic as that can be. But the songs on here that like touch on war or touched on maybe like gender expectations, stuff like that, they feel very personal, they feel very dismal, but overall the sound of this album is just so crushing, it's so powerful, and that's what keeps me listening to this album front to back. Fantastic project. At number 14 is an album that I thought was one of the more heart-wrenching releases of this year and one of the most beautiful releases of this year. The new record Patterns in Repeat from singer-songwriter Laura Marling. This album comes not too long after Laura Marling has reached motherhood, and a lot of these songs are about love, both current and past loves, her, experience as a new mother. And some of these songs on here are, I should say, all of the songs really on here are just so beautiful. I love the fact that there is a lullaby on this album, and the album closes with the instrumental of said lullaby. I absolutely love like every song here. Songs like Patterns and Repeat, the self-titled song, really just blow me away. But yeah, it is easily like if you're looking for a very emotional experience for this year, this is definitely one of the top picks. I would say, fantastic album. Love all the acoustic guitars and everything. Really beautiful. Number 13 on my list is an album that I admittedly probably had the most nonsensical fun with this entire year, and that is going to be the new Joey Valence and Bray album, No Hands. This thing is a bit of a tribute to sounds from like the Beastie Boys, sounds of these like, I guess almost like rap, imitation kind of things where they're just focusing on, being funny, showing, their abundance of personality on a lot of these beats. But what really makes this album stick for me is Joey Valence's production on this thing. He works a lot of EDM cuts into this album that fit into these like hip hop instrumentals, and they feel like club bangers. They are so fun. There really isn't that weak of a song on this thing. Tracks like The Baddest, they really stick to your head. Tracks like Pack-a-Punch featuring Danny Brown, one of my favorite, rappers of all time, is super fun. Danny Brown fits so well in this track as well. Bust It is a fantastic like introduction to this track, like a punk as well. I could go on and on. This album is so fun. It's so funny as well. There's some fantastic like current day like references and stuff like Roblox and stupid stuff like that, but it's hilarious. It is such a fun time. I really don't think you should miss out on this album. Whether or not your opinion on Joey Valence and Bray is good or bad within the realm of hip hop itself, I do think it's an album you really should check out. Next up at my number 12 spot is going to be the new JPEG Mafia album, I Lay Down My Life For You. This is an album that I admittedly was a little worried about before it came out, mostly because JPEG Mafia had been in a little bit of controversy beforehand, and I was worried that was going to reflect in his music a little too much, to the point where it lacks a little bit of focus maybe on the production like end of things and stuff like that. But all those concerns were completely washed once this album came out. I absolutely love the direction he took with the production on this thing, focusing more on like rock instrumentation and metal instrumentation mixed into these like really hard hitting, like almost club, esque like beats, stuff like that. There's songs that, sample like Brazilian like club bangers as well. Sin Miedo was a single on this thing that I was really impressed with and got even better once the album actually released as well. But yeah, it's fantastic front to back. Like, yeah, another showcase of why I think JPEG Mafia is one of the best producers that is out currently. And his lyrical flair on this album is as good as it ever has been. Definitely an album you don't want to miss, in my opinion. Next up at number 11 is an album that some of you may be surprised didn't land a bit higher, but I need you to understand that the only reason it does is because my top 10 for this year are filled with albums I just think are so absolutely incredible. And number 11 is actually going to be GNX by Kendrick Lamar. One of my favorite rappers of all time. Absolutely one of the most respected names in hip hop to this day. He surprise dropped this album, I think it was like November 22nd. I even remember the day because it was that big of an occasion when this thing dropped, especially after the whole rap beef that happened between him and Drake. And this thing is filled to the brim with exactly what the people were asking for. And it is a bunch of West Coast, really simple, hard hitting bangers, like one after the other. It is fantastic. It's super fun. I absolutely love tracks like Squabble Up, TV Off as well, with the whole like mustard call at the song that's been memed, half to death over the course of the past month. But there's also songs that showcase Kendrick's like some of his best storytelling to date. Songs like Reincarnated, I think, are absolutely fantastic. Probably one of my favorites from him in a long time. The Heart Part 6 as well, I think, is a wonderful, heartwarming tale about his time with TDE and his time with Black Hippie. Gloria, I think, is a fantastic song, mostly just going over his relationship with his own pen, his own love for writing, and stuff like that. This album is diverse, it's really fun, it's hard-hitting, simple in a lot of pockets, but at the same time it doesn't skip out on what makes Kendrick such a wonderful storyteller at the same time. Check it out. And with that, we are finally in our top 10, and to kick it off, we're going to start with an album that, again, really surprised me to no end. The new Knock Loose album, You Won't Go Before You're Supposed to. This is some of the best sounding metal I have heard ever. It is such a fantastic metalcore album. The production on this thing is immaculate. You hear every single sound they want you to hear on this album. From the cymbals to all the really deep guitars, the vocals on this thing are so blood-curdling. They are so immaculate, but they sound so perfect within the mix of every single song here. I cannot stress enough just how wonderful this album sounds. The instrumentation hits at every single point. And this album focuses on themes of religious upbringing, stuff like that, like having this primal desire for comfort that just seeps its way through all of these tracks. Some wonderful features as well. I love the feature from Poppy in the song Suffocate as well. Songs like Don't Reach For Me just absolutely stick out in my mind as some of the most fantastic songs from this year. And Sit and Mourn, possibly one of my favorite closers from this year. Such a fantastic album. It is absolutely incredible, and you need to check it out. If you're a metal fan and you haven't heard of this album, I don't know what you're doing. This thing is immaculate. Then at my number 9 spot is going to be the other album I mentioned earlier that was an extremely recent addition to my top 20, and that is going to be the new Chelsea Wolfe album, She Reaches Out to She Reaches Out to She. And this was an album that I had only really heard more about at the end of the year, and I am so glad I checked it out before the end of the year because, my God, it is one of the most impressive combinations of industrial music, electronic, trip hop as well. Chelsea Wolfe's vocals on this thing are so immaculate. They deal in these very vague themes surrounding your past, current, and future self, as well as getting out of relationships that are very, toxic, learning to live, on your own after such a horrible, experience in a relationship like that. And my God, songs like Everything Turns Blue on this album is so breathtaking. I absolutely love the instrumental. The wonderful chorus on this thing is fantastic. House of Self-Undoing as well is another favorite of mine. These like chaotic drum breaks that are just crashing throughout the entire song. One of the most like energetic moments in music from this year for me. And again, fantastic album. Really check it out if you're into electronic or industrial music at all. Great album. In my number 8 spot for this year, once again, we're circling back to artists from the UK that have been making waves as of the past year, up-and-coming artists from the UK, I should be specific. The new EP from Maruha titled Conla's Well. This thing blew my mind, and I could say the same for the last EP that these guys released, Knocknare, I believe back in 2023, if I remember correctly, at least, and that album blew me away. This one might just be a little bit better. This EP, front to back, is just filled with fantastic songs. The single that was teased for this album, The Invisible Man, is absolutely fantastic. I love the rush of drums, the like vibrant saxophone that's on not only this track, but like this entire album as well. Zeitgeist, I think, is one of the most chaotic and explosive tracks you're going to hear this entire year. Same thing I could say with One Hand Behind the Devil. It is fantastic. This EP, from the little intro track that they made to the ending to this album as well, or EP, I should say. I keep wanting to say album because, for one, I am so excited for these guys to release their debut full-length album, but at the same time, these EPs also have that same creative intent as an album, and it still has that same gratification you're going to get out of an album, despite the fact that these EPs they've released have only been around like 25 minutes in length, if even. But yeah, Muruha is absolutely killing it. These like hard jazz rock sounds that they've been working on throughout the past like few years have been mind-blowing, man. I am so excited for what these guys are going to do next. Please check out Maruha if you have not already. Fantastic group. Next up on my list, at my number 7 spot, is going to be the new Porter Robinson album, Smile. This album was so fantastic. This was actually my introduction to Porter Robinson, funny enough. I did only listen to Nurture after this album. I love both. They're wonderful. But Smile, for me, is easily one of the most impressive, like, synth pop, electro pop, like, albums of the year. It's some of Porter Robinson's most, like, personal and, like, heart-wrenching material to date as well, going over like his place in the world as an artist, the like parasocial nature of, you know, your own fan base as an artist and stuff like that. It's absolutely fantastic. The single to this album, Cheerleader, one of my favorite songs from this year. Once again, it just absolutely slaps. I love the huge and cheery instrumentation and production all over this thing. It is wonderful, man. It's definitely an album that if you're a fan of electronic music as well, just like the Chelsea Wolfe album, but for, you know, for a very different reason. If you're looking for like that nostalgic, like early 2010s or late 2000s, like kind of electro pop sound, definitely check this album out. Easily one of the best from this year for sure. And next up in my number 6 spot is definitely the longest album of my top 20 list for this year, but it is absolutely one of the most rewarding albums you're going to get from this year. And that is the return of Phil Elverum with Mount Erie's new Night Palace. I absolutely love this album, and it's been one of my favorite albums for autumn of this year and for winter of 2024, I should say. As well. The instrumentation all over this thing, it's very diverse. You get songs on this thing that are more like noise rock centric, some of them more electronic centric as well. The duo of like the two Wind and Fog songs, part 1 being like more noise rock and then part 2 being like a almost like a trip hop song, really just breathtaking as well. I love the more acoustic like indie folk and indie rock songs on this album as well. I Walk, once again, one of my favorite songs from this year as well. Same thing with Huge Fire. But yeah, Phil Elverum gets into detail about his place in the world. He goes back and, you know, reconsiders a lot of his worldviews that he's exhibited over past records as well. And it's a very introspective album, and I think it's one that actually rivals some of his best early work, like the Microphones album, The Glow Part 2. I really think this new album from Phil here is that good. It is absolutely wonderful. I originally had thought it was going to be in my top 5, but just outside of it by a hair. But fantastic album. If you're a fan of Phil's stuff, I'm sure you've been loving this album, as did I. And yeah, if you haven't heard it, go check it out, please. It's such a great album. And with that, we are finally kicking off our top 5 of the list. These are all albums that I think are fantastic. Some of the best albums of the decade, I would say, as well. And we're going to kick that off with the new Charlie XCX album, Brat. This is easily one of the biggest moments in music of this year, if not for the, Kendrick and Drake beef that also happened as well. But this one, ranks among that whole entire event because it's been that widespread and that popular, and for great reason as well. Because not only do you get a lot of slightly experimental, pop and club bangers all over this thing, think like club classics, Mean Girls as well, 365, some of my favorite tracks off of this project. But we also get some of Charlie XCX's most emotional songwriting to date, with songs like So I that go over her friendship with the now departed Sophie as well. And we see this vulnerable side of Charlie XCX wishing she had done more in this relationship. We hear songs that see Charlie XCX, looking into possible motherhood as well that really are just heartwarming. They're just beautiful songs. And not only that, but this album has such a great amount of replayability to it as well. It stays as fun as it always is with every single listen, but it also keeps its emotional highlights as well. And in fact, you get even more out of this album the more you listen to it. It really is one of the best pop releases of the year. I can see why it lands as #1 on so many people's lists as well. It is such a fantastic experience, even though it's, maybe not the longest album of the year, but it doesn't need to be when it's so jam-packed with all these fantastic highlights. At my #4 spot for the year is going to be the new Godspeed You Black Emperor album, the title of which I need to read. It being no title as of 13th of February 2024, 28,340 dead. Of course, the title unfortunately referencing the now outdated death toll of the Palestinian genocide that is still currently happening. And this album has that as its main focus in mind. And it may not be apparent just from the sound of this album alone, despite the fact that there are songs in here that do really capture that kind of fear and dismal energy. But it really is meant to remind you of it happening, and it's meant to make you want to learn about it. It's forcing you to educate yourself about the problem that it's, telling you about here. And Godspeed You, Black Emperor really just sounds the best they have in so long on this album. All of the instrumentation on here is just absolutely fantastic. I originally was very underwhelmed with this album, at least based on the expectations that a lot of people had for it. And I think a lot of that was kind of due to naivety, I would say. I've gone into exactly why in the revisited review that I did for this album, but it really is one of the most incredible, harrowing, beautiful albums of the year. So excited for, Godspeed You, Black Emperor to be releasing an album that is this great and has this many layers that I can keep digging into. Again, I absolutely love Lift Your Skinny Fist Like Antennas to Heaven, one of my favorite albums of all time, if not, maybe my favorite of all time. But yeah, another fantastic addition in their discography, one you have to check out, and do educate yourself about what's happening currently in not only Palestine, but also Lebanon right now as well. It is quite the tragedy, and they're going to need all the help they can get. Next up in my #3 spot for the year is going to be yet another album that I actually had a little bit of worry for going into based on some events that preceded this album's release. The new Jordy Griep album titled The New Sound. God, I love this album. And for those of you who know me, you know how much of a fan of Black Midi I am. And I was super excited to get into this album after I heard everybody raving about it after it dropped. I was a little concerned at first given the, very abrupt hiatus announcement from Jordy Griep, on the little Instagram live stream he did, and soon after that he released that he was, announcing that this album was coming out. And I was a little skeptical just because it seemed so quick at the time. What I hadn't realized is that he's been recording this album for a very long time at this point. But man, not only did it impress, but it blew me away. This has some of Jordy Griep's best material to date. Songs like Blues, Holy Holy, I think are fantastic. The Magician was, a Black Midi live cut that they did here and there as well, a full 12-minute song, and every single second of it is beautiful as well. Walk Up is another one of my favorites as well. This thing just hits time and time and time again, and God, you just get more and more every single time you listen to this album. I absolutely love Jordy Griep's unique voice, his unique vocal delivery across this whole thing, this whole like narrative surrounding this like pathetic, like wannabe rich guy who has everything, can woo all the ladies around him. It's such a fun, it's such a crazy, it's such a weird album, but man, is it one of the best of this year. And I really hope if you've heard this album, you're loving the hell out of it. I personally did myself, otherwise it wouldn't be in my number 3 spot of this year. But yeah, if you haven't heard this, you have to. It is so, so good. I cannot recommend this album enough. Next up, at my number 2 spot, my second favorite album of the year, the new Beth Gibbons album, Lives Outgrown. This album to me is one of the most personal, if not the most personal albums to me in terms of its subject matter. Of course, Beth Gibbons explores how time has affected her life. Now Beth Gibbons is, reaching the age of 60 at this point, and still somehow sounds as absolutely fantastic as ever. But across this whole album, she dives into this idea of mortality and, her past, how it's affect her current self. All these things like mixing up into an album that feels like it's one of Beth Gibbons' most personal projects to date. And as someone who loves Portishead, I still get so much out of this album as well. It really is fantastic. I love all the chamber pop instrumentation all over this thing. All of the instrumentation across every single track is breathtaking. It's entrancing. It is otherworldly. It feels so huge and so grand. And it just hits on an emotional level like almost no album has this entire year. And yeah, like once again, if you're a fan of Portishead like I am, you're going to get so much out of this album. And I cannot recommend this album enough. And to me, it's going to hit as one of the most emotionally impactful albums of this entire decade for me. Absolutely love it. Yeah, please go check it out. It is incredible. With that, the main event has arrived. What is my favorite album of the year? To a lot of you, it should be plainly obvious because I have not stopped talking about this album since I have heard it, but it's going to be the new Magdalena Bay album, Imaginal Disc. Holy shit, what an incredible pop release from this year. Not only pop release, but my God, this is easily, for me, one of the best albums this decade. All of the emotional notes about, loving yourself despite all of your imperfections through this like insanely psychedelic set of soundscapes and narrative through line with like this clone of yourself that embodies this perfect like envisionment of yourself, learning to, in a sense, like kind of reject that. At least that's kind of the way that I took it the first few times that I listened to this album. But man, all of the production, all the instrumentation on this album, every single sound on this thing feels so geniusly placed. I cannot stress that enough. There is not a single point on this album that takes me out of the otherworldly environment that it puts you in from the first few minutes. The ending to this album too, the Ballad of Matt and Mika, is honestly one of my favorite, if not my favorite, closers from the year as well. It feels so fun, it's so emotional, it feels like such a perfect sense of closure to an album like this, and honestly to the journey of this duo so far. It is so incredible. Songs like Image, Killing Time, Death and Romance, Watching TV all just hit so hard. Such an incredible album. If I had to give this album a score, I think I would genuinely give it a 10 out of 10 for just how wonderful, just how consistent, just how enveloping all of it is. There is no other album like it at this point in time, in my opinion, at least. And it's the one album, I will say, if you're going to listen to one album from 2024, it has to be this one. Such an incredible project. I cannot sing its praises enough. Please go give it a listen. Absolutely love it. All right, so that's going to be it for my top 20 of the year. This is the first time, I've done a video format for something like this. I've never talked about music on this channel before, so it is a bit of a new experience for me. For some of you who've been used to the content that I've posted beforehand on this channel, this may, be a bit of a shock, a bit of a switch up for the channel. But yeah, I'm really happy with all the music I listened to this year. Some of them I've been so obsessed with this year, especially the ones that are in my top 5 for this year. But yeah, let me know if you want me to do more videos like this again. If you want to check out all of the album reviews that I do on my Twitter and Blue Sky, I'll leave the links for them up here if you would like to go and check those out. Maybe I'll do another video soon, maybe something similar. Maybe I'll show off my, vinyl collection that I have as well. But that's going to do it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what your top 20 for this year are, or let me know what your favorite albums of this year were. And yeah, hope you guys have a wonderful new year. I'm looking forward to another great year of music. Thank you guys.